While considering the fundamental truths of our reality, the great minds of the past have reached many different conclusions, from isms and religions to paradoxes. There are so many ways that people have understood and interacted with the idea of God and this conceptual, all powerful, eternal force. And Octavia Butler, in her 1993 novel, discussed her own pseudo mystical interpretation of God as this conceptual change to raise to this idealistic level. And today, in my garage, we will be talking about that. In Octavia Butler's 1993 novel, The Parable of the Sower, we follow Lauren Olimina, a young teenage girl living in a dystopian version of America, more precisely California, and more precisely the Los Angeles area. So it's dystopian LA County mayhem, and she lives in a walled-off community with her father, her stepmother, and her three younger step brothers or half brothers. But it's a cruel, cruel world. It's full of murder, robbery, theft, rape. It is a very brutal environment, and within the safety of this walled-off cul-de-sac, they have a little bit, but it's not easy, and this entire world's a struggle for everyone, even those in the walled-off cul-de-sac. I'm going to refrain from some of the more exciting spoilers of the novel because they're pretty wild, and it's a really interesting, fast read for anyone who's interested. It is a little long, but it's really fast to read it. But Lauren's fate is to ultimately leave this safety community, or this supposedly safe community, to start the community that she's been developing, imagining, or in her own words, uncovering. The name of her community, the thing she wants to create, is known as Earthseed. It's semi-cultish, but the doctrine of it is very inspiring. It's all about individual empowerment through this recognition of God as change and you as the change molder. So it's a very self-empowering thing. I don't want to say it's like an indoctrinating weird cult, but there's like kind of weird elements to the verses that Lauren chooses. Lauren's first verse that we are shown in the novel, I believe it's the first one we are shown, is really interesting, and it describes the whole God and change concept, but it also attributes to God and change really interesting characteristics of the all-powerful and the subservient in a really interesting way. So let's dive in. God is power, infinite, irresistible, inexorable, indifferent, and yet God is pliable, trickster, teacher, chaos, clay. God exists to be shaped. God is change. Parable of the Sower 25. So really interesting line, especially if you consider that this is verse that she is writing in her own like pseudo religious tradition that she's developing in this futuristic failed state of America. It's a very interesting whole picture she paints as this develops, and that line I think is very powerful in terms of the themes of what's going on, because right here we see a really interesting detail. God is change, and change is all powerful. You can't stop change. It is an all powerful, godly, divine force that will just keep going in eternity. Yet, despite it being an all powerful, it is subservient in the sense that you can mold change. God exists to be shaped. But what's interesting about this is that this isn't this seemingly antithetical description of God. It feels antithetical, but what it really is painting this picture of a larger cyclical cycle between the individual and their environment. And I think the next line that I'm about to give you guys really helps describe how you yourself share those characteristics. We gave lip service to acceptance as though acceptance were enough. Then we go on to create super people, super parents, super kings and queens, super cops, to be your gods and look after us, to stand between us and God. Yet God has been here all along, shaping us and being shaped by us in no particular way or in too many ways at once, like an amoeba or like a cancer. Chaos. Parable of the Sower 26. So to go back to the idea of that cyclical relationship of change, you change your reality. Your reality changes you. You exist to be changed. You exist to change, and God exists to be changed, and God exists to change. Everything's changing and occurring and affecting in too many ways at once, like an amoeba or like a cancer chaos. But it does paint that picture and elaborate that picture of that seemingly antithetical description of God being all powerful and subservient. Well, you yourself are powerful and subservient, maybe not all powerful, but there's a cyclical nature of subservience and power, change and the changed. And it is happening all around you. When these things are happening, it's happening in both directions at once. And the line that I think is really interesting about acceptance and super people in that quote, people like to get outside of that cycle. They like to be, I'm going to accept the change as it comes. I'm going to relinquish my power as some sub creator role to positions of authority or influence. I don't want that noise. Super kings and queens, super cops, super parents, people to look after us and take care of us so we don't have to take that active change role ourselves. But the whole point of Lauren's thing is to get rid of that acceptance perspective and to excite people towards taking on this active participatal role with change, and therefore having this relationship with God. Whether through faith or through politics, there are those who refuse to take an active role in change and in their environment. And the acknowledgement of that ability, that role that you can just take on, the sub-creator role, the molder role, is crucial to Lauren, and I would assume Butler as well. Within a crazy world, one does not have to take a non-committal role to that around them. Another verse from Earthsea that we get, and it clarifies this idea I'm trying to speak to you about, the point of life to kind of be this confident, conscious, active role rather than the acceptance, non-committal role. This is a great line that elaborates that exact idea, at least from the perspective of Lauren and Butler. She goes, all successful life is adaptable, opportunistic, tenacious, interconnected, and fecund. Understand this, use it, shape God. The reason why this piece is pseudo-mystical or almost mystical is this line right here, because where mystics would share that understanding of God as this kind of all-encompassing conceptual force, this sort of absolute, this sort of infinite, I think they would like that description of God as change. Some might disagree, but I think mystics would agree with the description of God. What they would disagree with is the application or the practical side, where Lauren is telling you, act. Take this understanding of God and you and act. Almost to use the ego in a more conscious, active role, which is a good thing. But the certain mystics, or many mystics, I would argue, would tell you the goal is to detach from the ego, from the material connotations of existence, in order to become wholer in being, more closer to that infinite godness. But I find this line interesting nonetheless, because it is challenging the individual to take an active role in what's going around them. And we might not be in a dystopian reality, but what's going on around us right now is crazy. And to just kind of be a bystander to your reality with everything going on, it's a lot. It's a lot. And you don't have to do that. You don't have to change everything either, but to take an active role and change where you can change, be successful, be opportunistic, be tenacious. I think those are awesome things to take in to your value system, like Lauren has. Lauren recognizes the infinite and absolute in this conceptual way. However, on reflection, she says that the role of the individual is to acknowledge that and use the divine ability to take an active role in the shaping of the infinite. A recognition of mystical views while doubling down on the ego and its sense of vision and manifestation. However, not everyone is supposed to reach nirvana, and I agree with Butler here. For most people, it would be better to take on that tenacious, that molder, that opportunistic, but also, kind. You want to create the positive change around you. So, you got to be willing to make that. But yeah, another really funny line, just in terms of this idea of viewing your actions as this sort of God shaping. I think there's a really interesting line where Lauren realizes she made a small hiccup with her emergency kit, and she thinks, "Poor God shaping, lack of forethought. What now?" A very interesting line to show you how serious this concept is for Lauren and maybe Butler as well, where the actions we take in our life isn't just like, oh, we're changing. It's like, no, you are God shaping. This around you is God. It's a conceptual, infinite understanding of God and change around you. When you take an active role in it, you are God shaping. A very interesting phrase, but I think it says a lot about the level that this takes place in the character's mind. And in response to the idea that Lauren's God does not give a fuck about anyone, she goes, "All the more reason to care about myself and others. All the more reason to create earthseed communities and shape God together. God is trickster, teacher, chaos, clay. We decide which aspect we embrace and how to deal with others." Now, this is a pretty materialistic relationship with God. As a sort of a mystic, I cannot say that I think that's the only thing you should do. I think that there is absolutely reasons to take a more spiritual angle to associating yourself with divine qualities around you. But I think that this is a very strong practical argument for how to understand God in a conceptual sense and how to make that conceptual sense be practical in your life. Um, God is trickster, teacher, chaos, clay. You don't really talk to God. He doesn't really know you either. If you're not looking to get into this like spiritualistic mumbo jumbo of everything, you just want to live your life actively as much as you can. This is probably the strongest mindset. I would say it sounds awesome. There are so many real world examples of like molders and changers to choose from, that it's a little difficult. But in a class of mine, we were looking over Frederick Douglass and his narrative, and there was a line that I found that really stuck out to me while I was doing research for this. This line happens in Douglass's narrative shortly after he had a physical confrontation with a master of his, where he was tired of being punished and beaten, and he decided to become physical. And he sort of won this little scrap. It wasn't like a major, didn't, no one really got hurt. But like he sort of won it, and his master kind of let off him, and it gave him a renewed sense of spirit and self. And this is a really powerful line that talks about change within your life and change within your psychology at the same time in regards to that. I have already intimated that my condition was much worse during the first 6 months of my stay at Mr. Covey's than in the last 6. The circumstances leading to the change in Mr. Covey's course towards me form an epoch in my humble history. You have seen how a man was made a slave. You shall see how a slave was made a man. The world can be tyrannical. For Douglass in the time of slavery, it definitely was. And in the fictional novel by Butler, where the world is this dystopian failed state, the world itself is tyrannical. It's brutalizing you to its nature. And in face of that, it can be very difficult. Some people relinquish their choices. Some people don't know what to do. But I think the idea of taking an active role in that moment, being inspired to not let this just be how it is, but to take an active role in what it's going to be, even though it might be stressful, it might bring you pain, you're scared of it, your insecurities. The act of taking an active role in the change around you is crucial, especially in a tyrannical environment. And you can find examples all over the place of people who make a change. And it starts with that psychological, I'm not going to continue in this way any longer. And when those moments happen, amazing things tend to occur for those individuals and for the areas around them. They start to manifest visions and attitudes that they have inherent to them and have seen around them. And in the story of Douglas, he didn't have a perfect life. Becoming an active participant in the world around him didn't make it easy. But that line of how a man was made a slave, you shall see how a slave was made a man. Very, very powerful in that context of sort of not knowing how to take an active role and then just taking the active role and being and reaching some transcendental state materially, spiritually, psychologically because of it. It's a very beautiful story. So the world can be brutal and tyrannical, and although individuals don't have total control over the reality, the point of this is not to let reality subjugate you. Even though you can't entirely subjugate reality, to not let reality subjugate you, but to take an active role in the change, vice versa, to get into that cyclical nature, to be changed and to change, and so forth and so forth and so forth. Really interesting theme. And there are philosophers that'll argue that identity itself is illusory and that psychological continuity is what we mistake for identity. And that in reality, our identity itself has changed and the world around us has changed and everything has changed. You can find philosophers who talk like that too. And I think it's a really interesting idea to throw in at the end of here is that everything in some ways are a change. We have this conscious ability, but even the conscious ability is changing. And I think to take an active role in this big old soup that is change, rather than just be some passive ingredient, I think is an interesting idea, and it's a great theme and a beautiful story by Octavia Butler. Parable of Sower is amazing, and if you guys have not read it, I would recommend reading it. Great, easy, fast read with amazing themes. And, I like mysticism, but if that's not your vibe, this is a good lesson to take too. So I hope you guys had a good one today, because I did. Have a nice one. Peace, peace.